right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Origination Point podcast. I'm Bill De La Cruz, your host. And I just wanted to remind you all that we created this podcast to basically share real talk with real people who are doing real things all around the globe and are really striving to make change in the discourse that we have, in the ideas that we share, all with the notion that we're not talking about right or wrong. We're talking about how do we as a people move through the world that is really divisive in a way that we can stay connected and accept that while our perspectives will not always match, in fact, they rarely do because we're all unique, we're still part of community. And so, how do we realize that we can accept a different perspective that maybe we don't even agree with and still stay in community with each other? And so I have a guest today named Jennifer Boudrye who's going to tell you about herself. I'm not going to do that. And I think that what she has to offer is a very interesting approach to thinking about how we create allyship with each other, how we support each other. And so remember, if this podcast, if you really like the content, please subscribe, share it, because the goal for us is to create a worldwide community of people who have a space to have conversations, to think outside of the box, to increase our mindset, and to really see that we can be in community even when we have different ideas and perspectives. So we're going to jump right in, and I'm going to welcome Jennifer and say, how are you today? I know you're out on the East Coast. And how's it going out there?
Well, actually, I'm
Oh,
in
you're in the middle
the
of,
middle of
right.
the
Okay.
yeah,
You're,
almost
because you
smack dab
moved
in the
from the
middle.
East Coast and now you're kind of in the middle there in Ohio.
I
Okay.
did. Yeah, I am doing very,
Great.
very well. And I am really looking forward to this
Awesome.
conversation. I'm very
Well, why don't you
excited.
tell our listeners who you are and what you do, how you came into the space that you are talking about today?
Absolutely. So my title is I am a queer allyship facilitator. And my company is called Queer Allyship. And I have a very long and twisty road to how I got here. So I'll try to make it as concise as possible. I am the mom of three adults, children. They still feel like kids to me. My son is very proudly bisexual, and I'm also the bonus mom to a trans man. And I spent about 17 years plus working as a school librarian. 4 of those years as the director of library programs for DC public schools. So I was doing a lot of education for children, obviously, and for adults, and was always at the lead of DEIB work. And as I got a little older and farther into my career, I also started doing a lot of LGBTQ plus advocacy work and was working with an LGBTQ plus nonprofit in Loudoun County, Virginia, and started working as their training manager, providing training for community organizations, sort of at the same time recognizing that parents really, really needed support in parenting in general, because nobody teaches us how to do this thing. So we make the same mistakes or try to correct the ones our parents did. So I also got a certification as a parent coach. So I was working with parents of LGBTQ plus kids, helping them understand, learn about their children's identity as they were coming out, at the same time working with a lot of organizations. So my move here from Virginia to Ohio gave me the opportunity to sort of rebrand. And at the same time, a couple of months ago, I started a resource called the Queer Camp Fair, which is a internet resource directory that unites affirming camps and families. So I'm constantly trying to make sure that I connect people with the resources and the information that they need to live their lives.
So how does, I know we have a PFLAG organization here in Boulder County that I know is also directed at parents in the LGBTQ plus community. So was what you do similar or different from that?
It is. And I love PFLAG. And I always, always, always recommend folks that is the first place that people should connect with in their communities. But some people don't
Yeah.
have a PFLAG chapter that is accessible to them, or they're not comfortable working in a group. So when I work with parents, it's really those parents that want that one to one support and are afraid maybe to ask
Mm.
questions or feel uncomfortable. And they don't want to be judged or feel like they are doing the wrong thing. So, really giving them that space. And I have a process that I work them through, which is care, compassion, awareness, respect, and empathy. And it really helps them get to a place where we deconstruct some of their intrinsic bias and shift their mindsets so they can become affirming allies.
So if I needed support, I might reach out to PFLAG and not and feel like it's more group oriented. And if I'm not comfortable, or I might want somebody one on one, then that's really your niche is more just getting people who may be new to the whole conversation. Okay.
Yeah. And then at the same time, going into organizations and corporations and companies and providing training. I do a lot of LGBTQ plus
Mm-hmm.
101 and creating inclusive environments. And I'm finding it is still a great need, even in places that I thought would already have had the
Yeah.
information.
So talk a little bit about 101. What is that? So I imagine that's like the basics. Here's where you start, because I think what I found in doing this work for so long is that many of the topics around inclusion and belonging and even compassion and care, as you talk about it, are really big. And a lot of people will say, I just don't know where to start. So
Yeah.
what's the starting place that you introduce people to?
Yeah, the starting place really comes down to, first of all, defining, making sure that we're all using the same vocabulary, right? What do LGBTQ and plus mean, right? There's a lot of people who think that when we use the full acronym LGBTQ plus IA, that the A stands for ally, and it doesn't because we're not part of a marginalized
Mhm.
group, right? So really defining lesbian, gay, transgender, and intersex and either agender or aromantic or
Okay.
asexual, right? It's a lot of different A's. And bringing people to understand that in between all of these identities, there are combinations, there are degrees, right? And so a lot of the confusion right now around non-binary and what does it mean to be gender fluid, and then also helping people understand the difference between gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. And again, I used to describe it as a puzzle, right?
Mhm.
Different pieces, but I really now think of it more of a
Hmm.
kaleidoscope, right? Because things can shift and
Yeah.
change. And then helping people understand that this really is an intrinsic thing for each person.
So, and I think the other challenge you brought forward is that I know that I've been at this work a long time, and we keep adding letters or things to the definition. So it keeps growing, just like DEIB or JEDI. And people always keep asking,
And SOGI and all
what's
of
that new letter stand for? And
yeah.
um, so how do you bring people into this idea that there is a definition that may be different than your perspective?
So I use the word queer, and that used to be a
Hmm.
slang term and a derogatory term. And it has been brought back, and I have talked with a lot of queer people. And so I am a heterosexual, cisgender woman, right? And I am very clear about my
Hmm.
identity. And every time I have these conversations, I am clear that I'm speaking from this
Yes.
perspective, right? So for me, queer is truly an umbrella term that allows for all of the different shades underneath the rainbow, right? So the rainbow is not just red, orange, green, yellow, blue, and violet. They're in between. There are so many different shades that have all kinds of different names, and we keep naming new
Hmm.
things, right? New colors that we
Hmm.
find. So as people's awareness of identity and understanding of identity changes, they're creating new language to explain how they identify themselves. So queer is just for me the term that I use for anyone who is not straight cisgender.
Okay, so that's kind of the umbrella, and then underneath the umbrella are all the other intersectionalities of identity, and even those have all of these connecting points, because even some people don't
Yeah.
understand what intersectionality means. So they have different connecting points where I could be connected to a number of the identities within that umbrella, and that it, for some people, it's
That's
very fluid, where they don't
mhm.
really, it's not binary, in other words, where I'm this all the time, because I'm not. And um, so you have people, I'm imagining, that come to you because maybe they just found out that their friend or child or family member identifies with somewhere under the umbrella. And first, tell me about how you bring them into the conversation, where they have a little bit of wonderment around, gosh, I just found this out about my nephew, my cousin, whoever. And I'm sure there's some correlation to what you had to do when you found out from your own children that this is who I am, mom. And so I'd love to hear a little bit
Yeah.
about how how that works, or how that plays out for you, and then we'll move to another
Yeah.
question. So
So I start out with really exploring, where are you coming from, right? When is the first time you learned that somebody could be queer, right? Was it in church? Was it from your family? Was it from television or media, right? How did you get the information, and what stories do you tell yourself about queer people,
yeah,
right? And that's where we're going to start, because that helps me to understand if we're coming from a very religious perspective or from a media perspective.
so you're
And
you're
then
starting with their
understanding, I love,
mindset first about what do you think. Okay,
yeah, their
okay,
belief systems, and knowing that everyone has intrinsic bias because we exist in a society that is giving
yeah,
us information, right? So everything that we know, quote unquote, we
hmm,
learned. So it's possible to learn other
right,
information. Right. And so that helps me. I'm not going to judge someone for the beliefs that they have, but we're going to start there. And then I'm going to introduce additional information, and then, get to the place where we can see. And I often use the example, my son is now
hmm,
28, and I knew very early on that he was not
hmm.
straight.
So did you
And
have a sense of
that
it
was fine.
before he did? Okay.
Yeah, I kind of had that sense, your
Hmm.
kids sometimes pretty well. But I always assumed he was gay. And I grew up in the 80s, and it was very much pick a team. You're either straight or
Right.
gay. And he grew up with me messaging that, right? Very, supportive of the gay community, and that was all fine. He went to college, and at age 19, he was referred to as the F slur
Mm.
on campus, wrote a op-ed for his college newspaper, and in that he came out as bisexual. And I was like, what? I don't know what this, how does this work? Right? I didn't have
Right.
that knowledge or understanding. Obviously I've learned, I've grown. We were talking about 6 months ago, and again, this is, almost 10 years later, and he explained to me that growing up hearing gay or straight pick a team caused him to really hide his
Mm.
bisexuality from himself and from me. And so that is, part of the stories that I share are the mistakes that I made as a parent that I realize, right? And I love Maya Angelou's quote of, you do the best you can until you know
Hmm.
better, and then when you know better, you
Hmm.
do better. So a lot of this is a lot of the fear, a lot of the confusion comes from lack of understanding and a lack of awareness about
Yeah.
queer identities.
And and I think we live in a place today in 2024 where we're so divided on the whole planet that people are afraid to even talk about, especially these topics, because they're afraid of, well, what if I say the wrong thing? And I sit in these
Mhm.
spaces and conversations a lot, and I say, well, just presume that at some point along the path of this conversation, you are going to say something that's going to trigger somebody else. And
Yep.
so even the mindset of I'm going to say the wrong thing is different than understanding that we're all on this learning journey, to your point, and that when somebody gets triggered, there's just a conversation there. And so we don't need to necessarily feel bad, because I do work in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. I've done it for 20 years. And some of these conversations I'm behind on, or the
Mhm.
newest
Mhm.
letter or acronym or meaning, I have to ask my friends, like, what does that one mean? Because I haven't heard that one before. And
Yeah.
so,
And even when you have the information, right, we still have that intrinsic bias that is very, like, we're not
yeah,
aware of it. And so we might accidentally slip into something or let something go. And what I tell people is, again, you're a human, you're going to make mistakes. And when you do, and it's brought to your attention, you quickly apologize, you correct it,
yeah,
and you move
you
on.
don't have to like vacillate in it, or or beg for forgiveness, I guess is how I look at it too, because we're all going to make missteps. And so, and if you've been listening to our podcast, you know we talk a lot about biases. And so not only do we have personal biases, biases rooted in how we were brought up, even what you talked about, Jennifer, either you're straight or gay, like decide, was a bias that you've had to
Mhm.
deconstruct to realize that, well, wait a minute, there's this whole um, connection and intersectionality of identity, whether you're gay or straight, that we bring into it. And then we have all of these socialized stereotypes that are rooted in what society thinks about groups of people in the LGBTQ community. And then, even though those aren't rooted in facts, once they come up, if we don't check them, people tend to believe them. So now let's switch over to this idea of somebody who's been socially stereotyped to believe the opposite, from a either religious perspective or personal perspective, that being gay is some problem or some abomination or something, that some of those really big socialized stereotypes. And I know you're in those spaces also. So how do you approach people? Because on one hand, we were talking about people who come to you to say, I want to learn. And then we have this other group of people who are probably part of an audience that are kind of stuck, I guess is how I would say. So how do you
Yeah.
approach
Yeah.
that group of folks?
So I come to it knowing that I am not always going to be able to change
Right.
hearts and minds. There are just some people who are not going to be willing. And so I have to make the decision sometimes about how much energy I'm going to put there. But I'm still going to approach them with compassion and empathy and understanding that they came to that place from learning
Yeah.
something, right? And I will often pull, the idea or explain to them that I have a daughter who is a Lutheran
Mm.
pastor and a son-in-law who is a Presbyterian
Okay.
pastor. And I have it on their very good authority that God loves everyone. And I believe very strongly that if your religion is telling you to hate anyone, you're doing it wrong.
Okay.
So, that's where the conversation is going to end sometimes, because if someone is completely unwilling to hear and even entertain the opportunity of learning, then I can't always reach them, right? When it comes to family interactions, unfortunately, sometimes that leads to a
Yeah.
disconnection. And someone has to be willing to understand that you're making that choice,
Yeah.
right? By denying someone's existence, you are making that choice to not be in their
And I
life.
think that's an important thing for people to understand, because it's easy to put it out and say they're the problem versus recognizing that, well, no, I'm playing a role in this. And if my role is to deny my child or my cousin or my friend or whoever it is their identity, or not to get to know them, then you have to own that. And I think that's the biggest part of the bias work that people don't fully get. It's like, it's one thing to recognize you have a bias towards queer people. It's a whole other thing to then own the fact that you're willing to stay there, or own the fact that you're willing to be open to a discussion and to realizing that not everyone fits that stereotype or that bias that you have.
Yeah.
And so I think that's important for people to recognize that, because to your point, this is about choice. And I remember I was working in a city in Washington where they had some racial issues, Washington State, and I was doing a focus group all weekend with adults, and I was fortunate to do one with students. And this one senior, he said, he really wasn't specific about what he was talking about. My sense was he was talking about something in the LGBTQ plus kind of community, but he said, there's some values and beliefs that you all have in this room that I am adamantly against. I'm never going to change my perspective on that. And you are part of my community, so I'm going to treat you with dignity and respect. It's the best thing I heard from anybody, adult or young person, where he acknowledged that his belief system wasn't going to change. And yet, because the people who identified with the beliefs that he didn't agree with were still a part of his community, so I'm going to treat you with dignity and respect. I thought it was beautiful. And the way that he stated it was even beautiful, because the people, the students in the room, even appreciated it. So it's a whole different
Absolutely.
approach, to just saying, yeah, we're different, and yet you're part of my community. And I think if we could come to that level of acceptance, we'd have something right there to applaud in terms of how do we move through this divisive culture that we're in.
Yeah. Truly getting to the reality that we are all
Yeah.
human beings, right? That's the
Mm-hmm.
commonality. And I don't, sorry to sort of right turn back into
It's okay.
religion conversation. And there's, are you familiar with Armstrong? Karen
I'm
Armstrong.
not.
She won the TED Prize for her Charter for
Okay.
Compassion. And she is a former nun and did a ton of research on world religions and recognized that the commonality in every religion is compassion. And if we can just get there,
Yeah.
right, get to that place where we can have compassion for every other living person, we're going to be much
So
better
how do
off.
you define compassion?
So to me, in
Yeah.
my work, compassion, because compassion and empathy are very different things,
Yes.
right? Compassion inspires
Okay.
action, right? I recognize that you have a need, and I want to, especially when it comes to parenting, I want to fix that. I want to make sure that you're not going to be suffering from, pain, or I'm going to try to fix all of the things. Unfortunately, what happens often is that we're working from a place of compassion based on what we think is the right thing, is the right action to be taken, right? Empathy is, I don't understand what you're going through because it's not, because you're the
Right.
one living it. So I'm just going to be here
Right.
with you. And this is where, again, another one of those, like, how did I get there? Recognizing that as a parent, I lived in compassion all the time. My kids, I was there to fix, I gave perspective, I was all the time. And I really had to work at, and still work at, being in a place of
Mm.
empathy. When they come to me, give me what I call now the owie report, right, of everything that's wrong in
Yeah.
life. Whew, that's hard, right? But I don't have to fix any of that.
Well, and you bring up an interesting point that I've seen in people, because you described, like, as a parent, majority of parents have to live in compassion to raise children. And so I say the majority because it's not true for everyone. And the point, though, I think it is what I've seen is that everyone has the ability to be compassionate. I think we just use it selectively, and we use it
Mm.
in ways that we think benefit us, and then when a bias or a stereotype or a judgment shows up, we forget that we are a compassionate human being, and compassion just really is that whole idea of taking action to be accepting, where, like you said, empathy is just a, wow, Jennifer, I can feel what you're sharing with me through your story, and I don't need to know all the details. So so
Mhm.
it's interesting, and I wonder how many people out here listening to this have the ability to do these things, to be compassionate, to be accepting, and are doing it selectively rather than holistically and looking at difference from that perspective. So I want to jump
Mhm.
into the whole transgender conversation, because I
Okay.
think that that's it's a new, for some people it's really new, the whole conversation, and seeing people as publicly as we have who are transitioning, and and of course, we've seen it a lot in the athletic world, and then what I see is kind of the same thing I saw with diversity, equity, inclusion after the murder of George Floyd and those types of things. How people just went to, well, here's the solution. We'll just hire an equity director. We'll create an equity statement. And I was just reading an article today about how there's this reckoning now of, number one, was that even helpful? Did it change anything? And it didn't really talk about it. It's just something I always think about is, why do we just go to let's solve the problem before we've even had the conversation? So I would just love
Yeah.
to get your thoughts on that, because I think even for me who does this work, it's a challenging conversation about, well, where do I start and how do I share my perspectives, which I have, which are just mine. It's not the truth, and yet um, we see, like, again, especially in athletics, where actually we're seeing it now even in like modeling and the whole world of pageants and things like that. And so it's become a really interesting dynamic that I don't think we talk about. So how would you help even somebody like me who does this a lot have this conversation in a way that creates compassion and understanding?
Yeah. It's a
It's
big
huge. It's
conversation.
huge. And I know we're
So
not going to
it's
solve it in 10 or 15 minutes that
so
we
I'm trying to
have,
figure out
but
where to
yeah.
enter here. I think so. The response comes from a place of lack of awareness and fear,
Hmm.
right? Human beings don't love change. We don't like things being different. We like our boxes and we are very safe in our little boxes. And so when those boxes break or change, it sends us into a place of
Yeah.
dysregulation, right? So the reality is, and I'm going to state this as fact because not only it's not just my perspective, but I've, former librarian, I did some research. Um, Children know their gender by age 3.
Okay.
Okay. And if they're in a family, if they are born, if they are transgender, if they are born biologically male, believe themselves to be female, if they're living in a family that is accepting of that, they're going to grow up and identify as female and they'll be female. If they are in a family that denies that, nope, you're a boy, boys don't cry, boys do this, that's it, you're not a girl, then they're going to internalize that messaging and likely hide it, right, from themselves and from the world. So my bonus son didn't begin his transition until he was age 25. He's now
Okay.
35. I have a good friend who began her transition at age 55. And talking with them and comparing that to what seems like this explosion, right, of young people that are transitioning, is awareness, visibility, language, right? They didn't, it is new to have the level of visibility, to be able to look and see, oh wow, that person, that's me, right? That's how I feel. So, and I tell people when I started as a librarian in 2005, there were no books that I could buy hardly that had transgender characters or queer characters. By the time I finished my career in 2023, there were literally no books I could buy that didn't have at least one queer character, right? And so when I look at that change in marketing and that change in focus and availability, it tells me that there has been a shift. And when people question, like, how do you know? Right? My question, and I'm going to ask you this question, Bill, are you right-handed or left-handed?
Um, in some ways, I'm right-handed, and in other ways, I'm ambidextrous.
Okay. When you're right-handed the majority of the time, how do you know that that's what you are?
Um, some of it is societally driven that says you're right-handed. I mean, I can write with my right hand. I've also been a painting contractor, and I can cut as straight a line with this hand as I can with this hand. And so, in other
Mhm.
ways, I'm ambidextrous, where I use both hands. And so I think some
Yeah.
of it's societally driven. Some of it is this idea that if I use this hand the most, then I'm right-handed, and then that has a whole other connotation of meaning around, what does that mean to be right-handed versus left-handed.
Right. So if we shift that and instead of handedness, we're talking about sexual orientation or gender, there are people who know themselves firmly. I know myself firmly to be
Mm-hmm.
female. I have no
Mm-hmm.
doubt at all,
Yeah.
right? There are others who are more ambidextrous with it, right? Who are gender fluid. My daughter is was right-handed, right? She went to a school where, and you're right, societally everything
Yeah.
is right-handed. Scissors are right-handed, desks are right-handed. The majority of
Yeah.
everything is right-handed. She broke her arm in third grade and had to start writing with her left hand. And we realized, oh, you're
Hmm.
left-handed, but you had been put in a place and put in a world where we're forced to be right-handed. And so when we think about gender identity and orientation, sexual orientation as being intrinsic as
Mm-hmm.
handedness, it helps people be like, oh, okay, I don't really think about the fact that I'm female because I present as female, the world accepts me as female, I don't have to think about it. But if I felt intrinsically that I was male and the world was telling me I had to be female, it might cause some
Yeah.
challenge.
So some of it is just how we're socialized to believe this kind of binary approach to each other. And what I found with mindset and biases is that it's pretty fluid in terms of, and there really are no absolutes in terms of how we see each other.
You're not.
So,
But I'll tell you another
yeah,
quick story,
of
if I
course.
can, about the concreteness
Yeah.
of this, right? So I've shared my bonus son is
Hmm.
transgender and is married to a cisgender woman, and they have a child who will be 2
Wow.
next week. And when she had her first sonogram, he announced, "It's a boy." And literally my first thought was, "Is it?" Because as a trans man, you know that penis does not equal boy necessarily, right? But it was just, and so I'm thinking, as a transgender man, you're still that socially conditioned that biology equals gender. And so I think, again, it's everyone has to reckon with the messaging and the information that we choose to believe.
So, gosh, I'm sure we could talk all day when I open up these kind of questions, but I'm going to say it anyway. We don't have to go too deep into it. So when you said earlier that kids recognize their identity from a sexuality perspective by age 3, gender.
Gender by
Okay,
three,
gender. No,
sorry.
that was my mistake. Gender. So they recognize their gender identity by age 3, and then we have I do a lot of work in the education space where parents will say, um, that's too young to have a conversation or might indoctrinate them. And I will tell you my personal belief around these issues with race and all of these things. I think there is a maturation point of the brain where we at a very young age aren't our brain isn't mature enough to take in the information that's being shared. So I do believe there's like an age awareness component where I have other people who practice this work who say, no, we need to start talking to kids in kindergarten. I'm like, but a kindergartner's brain doesn't have the maturation to really discern what you're saying. So it's kind of a big question around what do you say to somebody who talks about indoctrination, or even somebody like me, who I think there's an age appropriate time to have these conversations. How do you balance? Because those are the two perspectives that are out there. Is you're
Yeah.
indoctrinating my child if they go to the library and see a book about a queer person or a trans person, and if you have this conversation, then you're doing something that I should be doing as a parent. So how do you kind of balance that?
So that assumes that communicating to a child that heterosexual and cisgender people is not
Okay,
indoctrination,
that's fair. Yeah,
right?
that's fair.
So it is. We have to get to the point where we understand that we are communicating information to children
Hmm.
all the time. We are indoctrinating them because they're not growing up in boxes that are, we're not putting like BF Skinner, sticking them away. We're educating them all the time. And so, should we be educating them about the reality of humanity? That there are people of color, that there are people who are disabled, that there are families that look all different
Yeah,
kinds of ways. All kinds of people exist. Or should we be educating them to our norm, which is white, heterosexual, Christian in this country,
yeah,
right? This is where that argument is coming from, and saying everything else is different. So my perspective is I hope we get to the point where we don't even have to have this conversation, because children are going to know that there are lots of different people in this world, and every one of them is a human being that deserves
yeah,
respect. But until people can understand that any information that you're giving a child is indoctrinating them, we're not going to be able to get beyond that conversation where it's this is right, this is wrong, right? This thing that I believe is the right thing, and everything that you're saying and believe is wrong because it's other than what I say and believe.
yeah.
And
Okay.
I also say, so again, former school librarian, right? So I am all about having access to information and a variety of voices. Um, I do agree with you that children can take in different kinds of information at different
Yeah,
stages, right? And reading about something is a lot different than watching it, right? The visual versus, the way that they're interpreting the information. Um, that said, if books could make people be something, then as a kid who grew up reading a whole lot of fantasy, I would be a magical creature,
yeah,
but I'm
yeah,
not, right? And so I think books, especially, are an amazing way to introduce children to other perspectives, other lives. And, the very infamous books are windows, mirrors, and
hmm,
sliding doors,
yeah,
right? And if a child is not ready to have that information, to absorb that information, they won't. It's just going to pass through.
yeah. And so based on this conversation, it's not so much the indoctrination piece that we need to talk about, because to your point, we're always doing that. Even having like my left-handed wife who wants to find something that is left-handed versus me when I go to find something right-handed, I don't even have to think about it. And so
Hmm.
so the idea more is what is the content of the things that we're talking about. And I think that it's important for all you listening that these are really complex conversations and they're not going to be solved overnight. And and we're certainly not going to all of a sudden make all of these rash decisions about them and now it's all fixed, because um, if it were that easy, it'd be a whole different world we all live in. And it's not. It's These are very challenging conversations. And so even the idea of having a spiritual background or a religious background, that's a form of indoctrination. Or thinking that the world is round, or back in the day when people thought the world was flat, then we're always indoctrinating or instilling a perspective that runs the risk of telling somebody, yes, this is the way the world is. And I think part of what
Yeah,
I'm hearing from you is we
absolutely.
have to start thinking about what's the impact of that. Because this is the way the world is according to Bill, might not be the way the world is according to Jennifer. And we can do what we're doing
Yeah.
now and fight over who's right or wrong, or we can sit down and say, well, tell me about your perspective on this, and where did it come from, and what's your story? And that leaves me with something to think about versus something to fight against.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you. And I think it's just, again, it is amazing to me, and again, doing the reason I do this work is the number of people who I have been able to see expand their view. And, I will point to my father's, just has passed not too recently. Um, and was very, very different than I am politically. And he was still able to completely accept his bisexual grandson and switched to using male pronouns when it came to referring to my bonus son. And because he knew these human
Yeah.
beings and he loved them as human
Yeah.
beings.
Everybody has a heart, and everyone deserves to be trusted, and everyone deserves to be treated with compassion. So awesome. So, what's your big hope? What's your big why in the reason that you do the work that you do?
My
Oh,
big why is I truly want the world to be safe and affirming for queer
okay.
people. Because if the world is safe and affirming for them, it's safe and affirming
Yeah.
for everyone.
And how do people seek you out? How does people want to have a conversation, or want to start a conversation, or have someone in their family who's either come out or is transitioning? How do they find you?
So I'm going to give you just one
Okay,
website, which is Queer Allyship, all one word, .com. And I'm on Instagram as queer underscore
okay,
allyship, and on Facebook as Queer Allyship.
great.
So, and also, I'm the only Jennifer Boudrye in
Oh,
existence. So if people search my name, they'll probably find
okay. Do
me.
you want to tell them how to spell your last name?
Sure, it's B as in boy, O-U, D as in David,
Okay.
R-Y-E.
Any last words or thoughts that you want to share with our listeners?
I I just want people, if someone comes to you and shares that they are LGBTQIA plus or any of the above, to just believe them when they tell you who they are in
Great.
this moment.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. It's been a pleasure talking with you. I'm so happy you decided to join me on this podcast. And for all you listening, you're listening to the Origination Point podcast. And if this topic, this content, if this is something that inspires you, share it, subscribe, and we'll see you at our next one. And remember to keep growing.